The sky turned dark on a Tuesday morning when the first ships appeared above Beijing, and Marcus Chun was drinking his morning coffee in his small apartment when the shadows fell across his window. He looked up and saw something that made his heart stop beating for a moment, because the thing blocking the sun was not a cloud or a plane, but a massive metal structure that seemed to stretch from one end of the sky to the other. Marcus was 42 years old, and he had spent 15 years working as a military strategist for the Chinese armed forces. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment when alien ships descended from the heavens like dark angels, bringing the end of the world. The sirens started screaming across the city within minutes, and people ran through the streets in panic, while Marcus stood frozen at his window, watching the impossible become real right before his eyes. He was not a tall man, and he was not physically strong in any traditional sense of the word. And he wore thick glasses that made his eyes look slightly larger than they actually were. His colleagues had always joked that he looked more like a librarian than a military commander. And they were not wrong, because Marcus had always believed that the greatest battles were won with the mind rather than with muscles. But on this day, none of that mattered, because the aliens did not care about human military ranks or strategies or anything else that humans considered important. The Valkyrie came down from their ships in waves of shimmering light, and they were terrifying to behold because they stood nearly 9 feet tall, with scales that changed color like oil on water. Their eyes were completely black, and they moved with a grace that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. And when they spoke, their voices sounded like thunder mixed with the hissing of snakes. Marcus watched from his window as they began to round up humans in the streets below, and he knew that he should run, but his legs would not move because his mind was too busy analyzing what he was seeing. He noticed patterns in the way they moved and communicated, and he saw that they seemed to be following orders from somewhere else, because their movements were too coordinated to be random. This observation would later save his life and the lives of millions of others, but at that moment, it was simply a thought that passed through his terrified mind. The door to his apartment exploded inward, and 2 Valkyrie soldiers stood in the doorway looking at him with their black, empty eyes. Marcus did not scream or fight, because he knew that resistance would be pointless against creatures that could tear a human apart with their bare hands. They grabbed him roughly and dragged him out of his apartment and down to the street, where hundreds of other humans were being loaded onto transport vessels. The journey to the main ship took only minutes, but it felt like hours to Marcus, who spent the entire time observing everything around him. Noticed that the Valkyrie soldiers all wore similar devices on their wrists that pulsed with a soft blue light. And he noticed that whenever one of them received a command, they would touch the device briefly before acting. This was important information, though. Marcus did not yet understand why, when they arrived at the main ship, Marcus was separated from the other prisoners and taken to a different section of the vessel. He was brought before the most terrifying creature he had ever seen in his life. A female Valkyrie who sat on a throne made of what looked like black glass. Her scales were darker than the others, and they shimmered with purple and gold highlights that made her look like a living galaxy. She was Queen Zithra, ruler of the Valkyrie, dominion and conqueror of 17 inhabited worlds across the universe. When she looked at Marcus, her lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but looked more like a predator baring its teeth. She spoke to her generals in the Valkyrie language, and they all laughed at whatever she said while looking at Marcus with amusement in their black eyes. One of the generals translated her words for Marcus and said that the queen found him particularly entertaining because he was so small and weak-looking. She had decided to keep him as a pet, a curiosity to show her visitors as an example of the pathetic creatures that inhabited this insignificant planet. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down because anger would not help him survive this situation. They put him in a cage in a room that seemed to be some kind of observation area. And over the following days, various Velthari officials would come to look at him like he was an animal in a zoo. Queen Zithra visited often, and she would stand before his cage, speaking to him in her language, even though she knew he could not understand. She seemed to enjoy watching his confusion, and she would laugh that terrible, thunderous laugh before walking away. But Marcus was not as confused as he pretended to be, because from the very first day, he began to learn. He listened to every conversation and memorized every sound. And slowly the Velthari language began to make sense to him. Was a military strategist after all, and learning patterns was what he did better than almost anything else. The guards thought he was broken because he never spoke and rarely moved from his spot in the corner of his cage. They thought the capture had damaged his mind and made him into a silent, empty shell of a human being. But inside that silent exterior, Marcus Chen was more alive than he had ever been because he had found his purpose. Would learn everything about these creatures, and he would find their weakness because every enemy had a weakness if he looked hard enough. Queen Zithra came to his cage one evening and pressed her face close to the bars, looking at him with those endless black eyes. She spoke slowly in her language, and Marcus understood every word, though he did not let his face show any recognition. She said that his planet would fall within months, and that humanity would become slaves to the Velthari dominion. Just like all the other species they had conquered, she said that she almost felt sorry for such weak and primitive creatures, but not sorry enough to spare them from their fate. Then she laughed and walked away, and Marcus watched her go while memorizing the way she moved and the device on her wrist that glowed brighter than anyone. Elsh did not know yet what all these observations would lead to, but he knew that knowledge was power, and he was gathering more power every single day. In the darkness of his cage, Marcus Chen smiled for the first time since his capture, and it was not a smile of happiness, but a smile of determination. The alien queen thought she had captured a weak and pathetic human, but she had actually captured the one person who could bring her entire empire crashing down around her. She just did not know it yet. 3 months passed inside the alien ship, and Marcus Chen counted every single day by the rhythm of the lights that dimmed and brightened in a cycle that seemed to match a day and night. He had become invisible to his captors in the way that furniture becomes invisible to the people who live with it every day. The guards walked past his cage without even glancing at him, because he had become part of the background. Just another object in the room that did not require any attention. This was exactly what Marcus wanted, because invisible people can see things that visible people cannot. He spent his days sitting in the same corner of his cage, with his eyes half closed like a man who had given up on life. But behind those drooping eyelids, his mind was working faster than it had ever worked before. The Velthari language had become clear to him after the first month, and he now understood almost everything that was said in his presence. The guards would talk freely about military matters and ship operations because they believed the human prisoner was too stupid and broken to understand anything. They talked about the invasion of Earth and the resistance that still fought in scattered pockets across the planet. They talked about the supplies that were running low on certain ships and the soldiers who were growing tired of this campaign. And, most importantly, they talked about Queen Zithra and the neural network that connected her to every single member of her military forces. This neural network was the thing that fascinated Marcus more than anything else, because it explained so much about how the Velthari operated. Every soldier, every commander, every ship in the fleet was connected directly to the Queen through a complex system of biological and technological interfaces. The devices on their wrists were not just communication tools, but direct links to Queen Zithra's consciousness. She could see through any soldier's eyes if she chose to, and she could send commands directly into their minds without speaking a word. This was why the Velthari military moved with such perfect coordination, because they were not really individuals making decisions, but extensions of a single controlling Marcus understood immediately that this was both their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. A military force that moved as one body was incredibly powerful, but a body that depended on a single brain was also incredibly vulnerable. If something happened to disrupt the connection between the Queen and her forces, the entire military would collapse into chaos. The soldiers would not know how to function independently because they had never needed to think for themselves. Marcus began to form a plan in his mind, but he knew that he would need more information before he could make it work. He started paying attention to the technical conversations that the engineers had when they came to perform maintenance on the ship's systems. They often worked near his cage because it was in a corridor that connected several important sections of the vessel. The engineers talked about power systems and data streams and encryption protocols, and Marcus absorbed every word like a sponge absorbing water. He learned that the neural network operated on a specific frequency that was generated by a central hub in Queen Zithra's throne room. He learned that the system was protected by multiple layers of security, but that it was also dependent on a constant power supply that could not be interrupted. He learned that the entire network could be disrupted by a specific type of electromagnetic pulse if it was calibrated correctly. The problem was that such a pulse would need to be generated from inside the ship because the hull was shielded against external interference. Marcus filed all of this information away in his memory and continued to play the role of the broken prisoner queen. Zithra continued to visit him regularly, and she seemed to enjoy showing him off to important visitors from other parts of her empire. She would point at him and speak about the weakness of humans and how easily Earth would fall to her forces. The visitors would laugh and agree that humans were pathetic creatures not worthy of any respect. Marcus listened and learned and waited because patience was the most important weapon in his arsenal. He began to collect small pieces of technology that fell or were discarded near his cage. Broken piece of circuitry here, a discarded power cell there, tiny components that the Velthari considered worthless garbage. Hid these pieces in a small gap in the floor of his cage where the metal plating had come slightly loose over the weeks. These pieces accumulated into a small collection that Marcus examined carefully whenever he was alone. He was not an engineer by training, but he had worked with military technology for many years, and he understood the basic principles of how electronic devices worked. The electromagnetic pulse device he was planning to build would need to be small enough to hide and powerful enough to disrupt the neural network. It was a nearly impossible task, but Marcus had nothing but time and desperation to fuel his efforts. He worked on the device only in the darkest hours, when the guards were at their least attentive. His fingers moved carefully in the shadows as he assembled and reassembled the components, trying to create something that would actually function. Many times he thought about giving up because the task seemed too difficult, but then he would remember the people of Earth who were suffering and dying while he sat in this cage, would remember his family and his friends and his country and all the things he loved about his home world, and he would pick up the tiny components again and continue his work. The guards noticed nothing because they had stopped paying attention to the broken human long ago. King Zithra noticed nothing because she was too busy planning the final destruction of Earth's last resistance forces. Nobody on the entire ship suspected that the small quiet man in the cage was building a weapon that could destroy everything they had worked for. Marcus completed the device on the 89th day of his captivity. It was no bigger than his thumb, and it looked like nothing more than a random piece of junk, but inside that tiny casing was a perfectly calibrated electromagnetic pulse generator that could disrupt any electronic system within a radius of 50 meters. It would not be enough to shut down the entire ship, but it would be enough to sever the neural link between Queen Zithra and her immediate command staff. And that was all Marcus needed, because chaos at the top would spread. Chaos throughout the entire fleet. He hid the device in the lining of his clothes and settled back into his corner to wait. The moment would come soon, because he had heard the generals talking about a final assault on Earth's last stronghold. When that moment came, Marcus Chun would be ready, and the Valkyrie would learn that the human they had dismissed as weak and broken was actually the most dangerous creature on their entire ship. The day of the final assault arrived on what Marcus calculated was a cold December morning on Earth, though inside the alien ship, there was no way to feel the seasons changing. Knew the date because the guards had been talking excitedly about the attack for days, and they had mentioned that it would coincide with a human holiday called Christmas. Queen Zithra had chosen this date deliberately because she wanted to destroy humanity's hope at the very moment when they traditionally celebrated. Hope enjoyed was the kind of cruel symbolic gesture that she enjoyed, and it told Marcus everything he needed to know about the kind of enemy he was facing. The ship was buzzing with activity as soldiers prepared for battle and commanders reviewed their final orders. Marcus sat in his cage and watched everything with the same blank expression he had worn for 3 months inside his chest. His heart was beating faster than it had ever beaten before, but he did not allow any sign of this to show. On his face, he had waited 93 days for this moment, and he could not afford to make any mistakes now. The door to his holding area opened, and 4 guards entered, followed by Queen Zithra herself in full battle armor. Her armor was magnificent and terrifying, made of the same black glass-like material as her throne, but shaped into plates that covered her body like the scales of a dragon. She walked to his cage and looked down at him with those endless black eyes that held no warmth or mercy. Then she spoke to him in the Valkyrie language, slowly and clearly, as if she wanted to make sure he understood, even though she believed he could not. She said that today was the day when his species would finally be crushed beneath the heel of the Valkyrie Dominion. She said that the last resistance forces on Earth were gathered in a mountain fortress in a place called the Swiss Alps. She said that within hours those forces would be destroyed, and humanity would have no choice but to accept complete surrender. And then she said something that made Marcus struggle to keep his face blank and emotionless. She said that she had decided to bring him to the command bridge to watch the destruction of his people. She wanted him to see with his own eyes as the last hope of humanity was extinguished forever. It was meant to be the ultimate cruelty, a way to break whatever small piece of spirit might still remain inside him. But Queen Zithra did not understand that she had just given Marcus exactly what he needed. She had just invited him into the heart of her command center, the one place where his tiny device could do the maximum amount of damage. Marcus allowed his head to drop as if this news had finally broken him completely. Guards opened his cage and pulled him out roughly, binding his hands in front of him with energy restraints that glowed with blue light. They dragged him through the corridors of the ship, and Marcus memorized every turn and every doorway, even though he knew he would probably never walk these halls again. The command bridge was larger than Marcus had imagined. A vast circular room filled with holographic displays and control consoles. Dozens of Valkyrie officers worked at various stations, coordinating the massive fleet that hung in orbit around Earth. Through the enormous windows, Marcus could see his home planet spinning slowly in the void of space. It was beautiful and fragile, and completely unaware that its fate would be decided in the next few hours. Queen Zithra took her place on a raised platform at the center of the bridge, where a smaller version of her throne had been installed. From this position, she could see every display and every officer, and she could issue commands to any part of her fleet with a thought. The device on her wrist glowed brighter than Marcus had ever seen it, pulsing with energy as she connected more deeply to the neural network. Marcus was forced to kneel on the floor near the front of the bridge, where he would have a clear view of the main display screens. The screen showed a tactical map of the Swiss Alps with a red marker indicating the location of the human resistance base. Thousands of green dots surrounded the red marker, each one representing a Valkyrie soldier or vehicle ready to attack. Assault began with a wave of bombing runs that lit up the mountain peaks with explosions that could be seen from orbit. Marcus watched as the displays showed human defensive positions being destroyed one after another. He heard the Valkyrie officers calling out casualty reports and damage assessments, and he understood every word they said. Humans were fighting back with everything they had, but it was not enough against the overwhelming force of the alien invasion. Queen Zithra watched the battle with satisfaction. Her lips curved in that predatory smile that Marcus had come to know so well. She glanced down at him occasionally, as if checking to make sure he was watching. Making sure he was suffering, Marcus kept his eyes on the screens, but his mind was elsewhere. Was calculating distances and positions and timing because everything had to be perfect. The device hidden in his clothes was pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. He could feel its weight with every breath he took, and he knew that the moment to use it was approaching rapidly. On the screens, the human defenses were crumbling, and the Valkyrie ground forces were advancing toward the main entrance of the resistance. Base Queen Zithra stood up from her throne and raised her arms in triumph as her generals cheered around hers. She turned to look at Marcus and spoke loudly so that everyone on the bridge could hear. She said that this was the end of humanity, and that the small weak creature kneeling before them was a perfect symbol of his defeated race. She said that after the battle was over, she would have him preserved as a trophy to remind future generations of the pathetic species that once inhabited this world. The officers laughed, and Marcus felt their contempt washing over him like a wave of cold water, but he did not react because he was counting seconds in his head. He was waiting for exactly the right moment when all the command staff would be gathered close together. He was waiting for the moment when Queen Zithra's attention would be focused entirely on her victory. That moment was almost here. The display showed that the Valkyrie forces had breached the outer walls of the resistance. Base human soldiers were falling back into the mountain, fighting desperately for every meter of ground. Queen Zithra stepped down from her platform and walked toward the main display screen to get a closer look at her triumph. Her generals gathered around her, all of them focused on the images of destruction playing out before their eyes. Nobody was watching the small broken human kneeling on the floor. Nobody saw Marcus slip his bound hands inside his clothes. Nobody noticed when he pressed the activation button on the tiny device hidden against his chest. The Parsted world was about to change forever, and the most powerful beings on the ship had no idea it was happening. The electromagnetic pulse was invisible and silent, a wave of energy that passed through the command bridge in less than a second, but its effects were immediate and devastating in ways that no one except Marcus could have predicted. Devices on every wrist in the room flickered and went dark, and for a moment there was complete silence on the bridge. Then the screaming began. Queen Zithra clutched her head and fell to her knees as the neural connection that had linked her to millions of soldiers was suddenly and violently severed. The sensation must have been like having a part of her brain ripped away, because she screamed with a sound that was more animal than intelligent being. Her generals collapsed around her, each of them experiencing the same terrible disconnection from the network that had defined their existence. The officers at the control console stumbled and grabbed at their stations as if the floor was tilting beneath their feet. They had spent their entire lives receiving commands directly into their minds, and now those commands had stopped. They did not know what to do because they had never needed to think for themselves before. Marcus moved quickly because he knew that confusion would not last forever. He twisted his hands against the energy restraints and found that they had also been affected by the pulse. The blue glow had faded, and the restraints fell away from his wrists like dead vines falling from a tree. He was free, and nobody was paying attention to him because they were all too busy dealing with their own pain and confusion. Marcus ran to the nearest control console and pushed aside the officer, who was slumped over it. His fingers flew across the interface as he accessed the ship's communication systems. He did not fully understand Velthari technology, but he had watched the officers work for months, and he had learned the basic operations. He found what he was looking for: the emergency broadcast channel that would reach every ship in the fleet. He opened the channel and spoke in the Velthari language. His accent imperfect, but his words clear and unmistakable. He said that Queen Zithra was dead and that the command structure had been destroyed. He said that all forces should retreat immediately or face destruction. He said that the humans had developed a weapon that could kill Velthari from a distance. None of this was true except for the part about the command structure. But Marcus knew that the soldiers in the field had no way to verify his claims. All they knew was that the connection to their queen had been severed, and now a voice was telling them that she was dead. Panic spread through the fleet like fire spreading through dry grass. Ships that had been coordinating perfectly began to drift out of formation as their crews lost contact with the central command ground forces on Earth, stopped their advance, and looked up at the sky in confusion. Some units began to retreat while others stood frozen in place, waiting for orders that would never come. The battle for the Swiss Alps ground to a halt as the Velthari military machine fell apart in real time. On the command bridge, Queen Zithra finally managed to rise to her feet. Her eyes found Marcus standing at the control console, and for the first time, he saw fear in those black depths. She screamed a command at her guards, but they did not respond because they could no longer hear her thoughts. She tried to activate her wrist device, but it remained dark and lifeless on her arm. Marcus turned to face her with a calmness that surprised even himself. He spoke to her in her own language and told her that her empire was crumbling around her. He told her that the forces she had sent to destroy humanity were now scattered and leaderless. He told her that she had made the mistake of underestimating a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars without the help of neural networks or advanced technology. Queen Zithra lunged at him with her clawed hands extended, fury replacing the fear in her eyes. She was still physically powerful even without her technological advantages, but Marcus had anticipated this moment, and he had already moved to the other side of the console. He pressed another sequence of buttons, and the ship's internal security system activated. Energy barriers sprang up around the command platform, trapping Queen Zithra and her recovering generals inside a cage of light. The irony was not lost on Marcus as he watched the alien queen beat her fists against the barrier that held her prisoner. She had kept him in a cage for 3 months, and now she was the one who could not escape. The displays around the bridge showed chaos spreading throughout the Velthari fleet. Ships were colliding with each other as their crews struggled to operate without centralized control. Ground forces were being overwhelmed by human counterattacks as the resistance fighters realized that something had changed in their favor. Marcus found the long-range communication system and opened a channel to Earth. He identified himself and reported that he had disabled the Velthari command structure from inside their flagship, gave coordinates and tactical information, and told the human commanders to press their advantage before the enemy could recover. The response came back within minutes, a voice filled with disbelief and hope, asking him to confirm what he had said. Marcus confirmed everything and added that he would try to maintain control of the flagship for as long as possible. He did not know how long that would be, because the Velthari officers were starting to recover from their shock. Some of them were looking at him with new awareness, understanding for the first time that the weak human prisoner had somehow become the most dangerous being on the ship. Marcus backed away from the console and grabbed the weapon from a fallen guard. It was too big for his hands, but he managed to hold it steady as he pointed it at the officers who were starting to move toward him, told them to stay back, and his voice did not waver even though his heart was pounding in his chest. The next few hours would determine whether humanity survived or perished. Marcus Chun was ready to fight for every minute of those hours, if that was what it took. He had spent 93 days preparing for this moment, and he would not let it slip away now. The battle for the flagship lasted 6 hours, and Marcus Chun fought for every single minute of that time. He held the command bridge with nothing but a stolen weapon and his knowledge of the ship's systems. Valkyrie officers tried multiple times to retake control, but Marcus had locked them out of the critical systems using codes he had memorized during his months of observation. When they tried to rush him physically, he used the weapon to drive them back. And when they tried to cut power to the bridge, he rerouted it from other sections of the ship. Was not a soldier, and he had never been trained for combat, but desperation gave him strength. He did not know he possessed Queen Zithra watched from her energy cage with hatred burning in her black eyes. She screamed threats and curses at him in her language, promising that she would tear him apart with her bare hands. When she got free, Marcus ignored her because he had more important things to worry about. The display showed him what was happening across the planet and in the space around it. The Valkyrie fleet was in complete disarray as ships tried to operate without their neural network. Some captains managed to restore order on their individual vessels, but they could not coordinate with each other. The human resistance forces were pushing back on every front, taking advantage of the chaos to reclaim territory that had been lost in the Swiss Alps. The defenders had emerged from their mountain fortress and were routing the confused alien ground forces. Ships were being captured or destroyed as human pilots flew salvaged aircraft into battle against enemies who could not respond effectively. It was not a clean victory because many humans died in those hours of fighting, but it was a victory nonetheless, and that was something that had seemed impossible. Just one day earlier, the rescue team reached the flagship 8 hours after Marcus had activated his device. Human soldiers and captured Valkyrie armor fought their way through the corridors of the massive ship. They found Marcus on the command bridge, exhausted and wounded from a fight with a guard who had nearly overpowered him, but he was alive, and the bridge was still under his control, and Queen Zithra was still trapped in her energy cage. The soldiers stared at the alien queen with a mixture of fear and wonder, because this was the being who had terrorized their planet for months. She stared back at them with defiance, but the fear was visible beneath her anger. She knew that her empire was crumbling and that she was now a prisoner of the species she had dismissed as weak and worthless. Marcus handed over control of the bridge to the military officers who had come with the rescue team. He showed them how to operate the basic systems and gave them all the information he had gathered during his captivity. Then he sat down on the floor because his legs could no longer support his weight. A medic came to treat his wounds, and someone gave him water, which he drank gratefully. The celebration around him seemed distant and unreal because he was too tired to feel anything except relief that it was finally over. The following weeks brought news of victory after victory as the human forces pressed their advantage. Without their neural network, the Valkyrie could not mount an effective defense. Their soldiers surrendered in large numbers because they had never learned how to fight without commands from above. The ships that tried to flee were hunted down by human forces using captured alien technology. Within a month, the invasion that had threatened to end human civilization was effectively over. Queen Zithra was brought to trial before an international court that had been hastily assembled to deal with the unprecedented situation. She refused to speak in her own defense and showed no remorse for the millions of humans who had died during her invasion. The court sentenced her to life imprisonment in a specially constructed facility where she would spend the rest of her days. Some people wanted her executed, but others argued that keeping her alive would allow humans to learn more about Valkyrie technology and biology. Marcus testified at the trial and told the story of his captivity and his plan to destroy the neural network. The courtroom was silent as he described the months of observation and learning and waiting, explained how he had built the electromagnetic pulse device from scraps and garbage that the Valkyrie had ignored. He explained how he had waited for exactly the right moment to strike, and he explained that he had succeeded not because he was strong or powerful, but because he had been patient and observant, and willing to use his mind as a weapon. When the trial was over, Marcus was hailed as a hero by people all around the world. They called him the man who saved humanity, and they wanted to celebrate him with parades and medals and monuments. But Marcus did not want any of those things, because he knew that he had only done what needed to be done. He returned to his small apartment in Beijing, which had somehow survived the invasion mostly intact. He sat by his window and looked out at the city that was slowly rebuilding itself. The scars of the invasion were visible everywhere, but so were the signs of hope and recovery. Children played in streets that had been battlefields just weeks before. Workers cleared rubble and constructed new buildings on the foundations of the old life was continuing, because that was what life did. It found a way to continue even after the darkest times. Queen Zithra had believed that humans were weak because they were small and fragile and did not have advanced technology. She had looked at Marcus and seen nothing but a pathetic creature worthy only of contempt, but she had failed to understand that human strength came from something that could not be measured or quantified. It came from the ability to adapt and learn and survive against impossible odds. It came from the willingness to fight for something greater than oneself, and it came from the understanding that true power was not about physical strength or technological superiority, but about the mind that controlled them. Marcus Chen had turned the tide of a war, not with weapons or armies, but with patience and intelligence and an unbreakable will. He had proven that the greatest battles are won not by those who are strongest, but by those who are wisest. And as he sat by his window, watching the sun set over a free world, he knew that this was a lesson the universe would not soon forget. The small, quiet man with the thick glasses had defeated an empire and saved his species, and he had done it simply by refusing to be what his enemies expected him to be.